History is full of mothers who would do anything to put their sons on the throne. But this Roman mother, she was in a league of her own. To make her son the emperor, she poisoned her husband. She spilled the blood of her own kin. And when that son finally took the crown, well, that's when things took a turn for the terrifying. Instead of gratitude, the son began plotting to end his mother's life. Plans so twisted, so dark, they still haunt historians today. This isn't just a story of rivalry. It's the story of an emperor whose hatred reached all the way to his mother's bedside. If you think you've heard every story about toxic mothers, hold on. Because what happened between Nero and Agrippina? History itself is still struggling to find the words for it. Agrippina surviving wasn't a miracle. It was the start of a much more horrific catastrophe. She thought she had won. But she had no idea that history had already written an ending for her, one that is almost impossible to imagine. This isn't just a tale of murder. It's the story of two predators who gave life to one another. One placed the crown on a head, while the other drenched that crown in blood. And remember, when two monsters clash for power, nothing is left standing. If you think you know what a strict mother looks like, you haven't seen the real face of Agrippina. And if you want to see the absolute limit of a son's hatred, wait until you see the madness of Nero. A madness that would leave a permanent scar on the face of history. Rome had many words for treason and madness, but for the bloody game played between Nero and Agrippina, history itself goes silent. All we have left are the bodies they left behind, and the horrific memories that still seem to drip from the walls of those ancient palaces. Before we step into the dark corridors of the royal palace, where this nightmare became a reality, drop a comment with your city and country. Because after what you're about to see today, you'll never look at family or love the same way again. Agrippina didn't have blood in her veins. She had a hunger for power. She was the sister of Caligula, Rome's most insane emperor. She had watched him from the edge of exile and death. And when she finally returned to Rome, she wasn't looking for peace. She was looking for revenge. Roman law didn't allow a woman to sit on the throne. But Agrippina knew exactly how to pull the strings from behind the curtain. Her pawn, her own son, Nero. But there was one obstacle left: her husband and the emperor of Rome, Claudius. Claudius already had his own heir, but Agrippina had decided that history needed to be rewritten. She did what only a cold-blooded woman of ancient Rome could do. She bartered for her husband's life. And this death wasn't an accident. It was a conspiracy, crafted with surgical precision and absolute cruelty. Agrippina chose her weapon very carefully. She tracked down Italy's deadliest mushrooms, the kind that don't kill you instantly. They deceive you. At first, the poison feels like simple indigestion. But on the inside, it silently shuts down your organs, one by one. To pull this off, she hired a professional assassin named Locusta. The people of Rome called her the secret servant. Locusta prepared the lethal dish, and Agrippina, with the smile of an executioner, served it to her husband. As Emperor Claudius took those bites, there wasn't a single spark of mercy in Agrippina's eyes. Within hours, the most powerful man in Rome was gasping for air on his deathbed, clawing at his own throat, right in front of the woman who had poisoned him. After Claudius was gone, Agrippina trapped the Senate in her web of lies. She placed 16-year-old Nero on the throne. Nero was the emperor, sure, but only in name. Agrippina stood behind him like a shadow, whispering the very words into his ear that he was forced to speak to the Senate. Nero had become a puppet with the strings firmly held in his mother's ruthless hands. Whenever Nero signed a royal decree, he held the pen, but the will belonged to his mother. Agrippina's arrogance grew so vast that she issued coins where her face sat right next to the emperor's. Her message was crystal clear. You only exist because of me. But times were changing. That teenage boy was growing up, and predators don't stay in chains forever. To escape his mother's oppression, Nero sought refuge in the arms of a common woman named Acte. When Agrippina found out, she was beyond furious. She paced the palace rooms, screaming, reminding Nero that without her, he was nothing more than an ordinary man. But this time, there was no fear in Nero's eyes. Instead, there was a coldness, a chill like ice that shook even Agrippina to her core. Whispers began to echo through the palace halls, whispers so dark they made the marble walls tremble. Rome had seen emperors spill the blood of their kin before, but what was brewing between Nero and his mother? It was something far more sinister. Rome had seen emperors claim to be gods. They had seen public executions. But the rumors leaking out of the palace about Nero and Agrippina, they terrified the entire city. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was a story that crossed every line of morality, a story that made the pens of Roman historians shake. The famous historians Tacitus and Suetonius, who had access to the secret royal records, both agree on something truly horrific. Agrippina, in a desperate attempt to regain control over her son, crossed a boundary that no mother should ever cross. Suetonius writes that Nero would take long journeys with his mother in a closed carriage. And when they stepped out, the marks on their clothing told a story that words were too ashamed to speak. Tacitus goes even further. He writes that Agrippina, in a state of intoxication, tried to lure Nero into an intimacy that was a direct insult to the sacred bond of motherhood. Nero's advisor, the great philosopher Seneca, watched all of this in absolute horror. Nero's advisors began using Acti as a shield, trying to build a wall between him and his mother before everything turned to ash. Whether these historical accounts are the absolute truth or just poisonous rumors spread by enemies, one thing is certain. The relationship between Nero and Agrippina had deteriorated so badly that the Roman people were ready to believe anything about them. Think about that for a second. These were people who had survived the madness of Caligula. And yet, when they looked at these two, they would say, yeah, they're capable of anything. Imagine being the master of the world's greatest empire, but you're still terrified of your mother's shadow. Nero's hatred wasn't just about the throne, it was a battle for his own soul. It was a psychological wound that followed him everywhere. No matter where he turned, he saw Agrippina. In his palace, in his dreams, and in every corner of his mind. Agrippina was like a web, and Nero realized there was only one way out. Death. Agrippina was in Nero's palace, she was by his throne, and she lived in his nightmares. Every time Nero turned around, he saw his mother's shadow reminding him, "Everything you are, you owe to me." Nero finally decided that this shadow had to be buried in the darkness of a grave forever. But how do you kill a woman who is a master of death herself? Agrippina knew that in the game of power, a poisoned cup could appear at any moment. So for years, she had turned her body into a fortress. Every morning, she took a tiny, non-lethal dose of various poisons to build immunity. This was called Mithridatism, a technique that made her body invincible against the greatest weapon in Roman politics. Nero, unaware of this, went back to Locusta, the same assassin who had taken out Claudius. He thought poison would do the trick again. He had no idea his mother had already defeated death. Locusta, what we would call a contract killer today. She was an expert in making murders look like natural causes. When Nero summoned her, she arrived with a demonic collection of toxins, labeled from instant death to slow and agonizing. But Nero's request was very specific. I need something that can kill a woman who has spent her entire life listening for the footsteps of death. When Nero revealed he was talking about murdering his own mother, the air in the room turned ice cold. Even a professional assassin trembled, because killing the mother of an emperor wasn't just a crime. It was a tear in the fabric of nature itself. But in front of Nero, no was never an option. Locusta prepared a mixture so lethal it was meant to crush any resistance. During a private dinner, Nero had the poison slipped into Agrippina's food. He sat there watching her chew every single bite, waiting for the tremors, waiting for the light to leave her eyes. But nothing happened. Agrippina finished her meal, looked up, and stared directly into her son's eyes with a smile. It wasn't the smile of a mother. It was the smile of someone who knew that death had no power over her. She knew she had been poisoned, and she knew that in this moment, Nero had lost. Nero's rage was now spiraling out of control. That triumphant smile from Agrippina felt like a dagger in his chest, a smile that seemed to say, "You are still just a child to me." He screamed at Locusta, "Why is she still alive?" But she had no answer. Nero realized that chemicals wouldn't work on this woman. He needed something bigger. He summoned his architects and shipbuilders for a secret mission. His order was simple yet horrific. Build a royal ship. Make it look fit for a queen on the outside, but make it a death trap on the inside. He ordered a mechanism where, at a single signal, the heavy lead roof of the cabin would collapse, crushing everyone beneath it. And at the same time, the hull would split open so the sea could swallow her in seconds. A murder the world would call an accident. Brilliant and cowardly. With a mask of poisonous love, Nero sent a message to his mother. "Mother, come join me for the festival. I've sent my private ship just for you." Agrippina was suspicious, but she was unaware of the new trap her son had set. Agrippina had her doubts, but to refuse would be to admit defeat in front of the world. And maybe deep down she still believed she could control him. She arrived, walking straight into the invitation of death. The night before the journey, Nero gave the performance of a lifetime. He gave his mother a farewell hug, kissed her forehead, and held her so tightly it felt like he never wanted to let go. The historian Tacitus writes that maybe, just for a second, the son inside Nero woke up one last time. Maybe he felt the weight of the sin he was about to carry. But then he watched her board that ship. The night was silent. The sea was calm. Agrippina was in her cabin, drifting into a deep sleep. When suddenly, with a bone-chilling crash, the ceiling came screaming down. Heavy wooden beams came crashing down, crushing everything in their path. Agrippina's maid was trapped under the debris and died instantly. But Agrippina, the woman who made a habit of dodging death, survived yet again. She was injured, she was bleeding, but she was conscious. Before she could even catch her breath, the floorboards of the ship split open. The cold black water of the Mediterranean began rushing in. Nero's engineered accident was in full swing. Agrippina was now 50 years old. She had spent her entire life on the soft beds of royal palaces, wrapped in silk. She had zero training on how to survive a shipwreck. But as she was tossed into those dark, freezing waves, it took her exactly 1 second to realize what was happening. This wasn't an accident. This was a death trap set by her own son. But Agrippina, she refused to die. She dove into the darkness of the sea and started swimming toward the shore. All around her, servants were screaming and drowning, but she didn't stop. Her muscles were burning. Her lungs were screaming for air, and the salt water was stinging her open wounds. But she kept moving. Finally, she collapsed onto the sand, coughing up salt water, gasping for breath, dragging herself across the beach. She was wounded, she was broken, but she was alive. Nero tried to poison her, she survived. Nero tried to crush her, she survived. Nero tried to drown her, she still escaped. She was a force of nature that even death refused to take. Nero was done being subtle. Poison and small conspiracies had failed against Agrippina's iron will. He needed something bigger. He needed engineering. He summoned the empire's finest architects and ship designers. His order? Build a royal ship decorated with gold and silk on the outside, but hiding a mechanism of death on the inside. Nero's instructions were crystal clear. One signal to drop the heavy roof, crushing everyone below, and then the hull must detach to sink into the depths. To lure her in, Nero used the Festival of Baiae as an excuse. Agrippina had her doubts, but a refusal would mean a public loss of face, so she stepped on board. The night before the voyage, Nero performed a masterpiece of deception that history will never forget. He hugged his mother, held her close, and kissed her forehead. The historian Tacitus writes that maybe, in that split second, Nero remembered his childhood. Maybe his hand trembled just a little. But he had already sold his soul, and he sent his mother toward the death ship. The Mediterranean was eerily calm. Moonlight danced on the waves. Agrippina lay in her magnificent cabin, completely unaware that directly above her, massive beams of death were waiting to fall. And then, a violent explosion shattered the silence. Heavy wooden planks and iron weights came crashing down, crushing human bone like dry twigs. Agrippina's servant, Acironia, was pinned under the debris and died instantly. Blood and screams filled the air, but Agrippina, miraculously, survived once again. Before she could even gasp for air, the floorboards detached. The cold, black water began rushing in, eager to swallow everything. Agrippina was 50 years old. She had spent her life in palaces. She had zero training in fighting the sea. But she realized instantly this was no accident. This was a murder trap set by her own son. And she refused to die. She dove into the black water and began swimming through the darkness of the Mediterranean toward the shore. Her muscles were burning like fire. Her lungs were screaming for a single drop of air. But she kept moving. Finally, she collapsed onto the sand, coughing up salt water, bleeding, exhausted, but alive. The silence of the night was ripped apart by a brutal blast. That ship, which looked like a queen's dream, became a piece of hell in an instant. Massive beams fell like lightning. Agrippina's loyal servant was crushed under the wreckage, her blood spreading across the royal deck like cheap paint. It was a dance of death and a chorus of screams. But Agrippina? She was wounded, but her breath remained. Before she could recover from the shock, the hull of the ship opened like the jaws of a predator. The ice-cold water was desperate to pull her under. Agrippina had seen 50 years of life wrapped in soft silk and golden halls. She had no experience with the fury of the waves. But in that moment, she knew. This wasn't the ocean's rage, it was her son's murdered trap. And then she did the unexpected. She refused to surrender to death. She dove into that black water, where the final gasps of drowning men echoed all around her. She swam. The fire of survival inside her was stronger than the waves. Finally, she hit the sand. Gasping, coughing, broken, but standing. Nero tried to poison her, she survived. Nero tried to crush her, she survived. Nero tried to drown her, and she still rose. She lay on the sand, staring at the sky, perhaps thinking that the sun she gave a throne. Now it was time to stain that throne with his blood.